And if anybody would like to ask questions that perhaps pertain to the panel as a whole, okay, Mark.
Yes, I was very struck by the fact, well, that in many ways this does build on very interestingly from our conference last year, which was called Portraiture as Interaction. And what we've seen in all three papers is the way in which photography and portraiture have been pulled together in really fascinating ways to tell particular kinds of histories of Britishness or of empire. And it'd be great to hear you all reflecting on the ways in which photography and portraiture in your talks interact, and the ways in which this issue of photographer's seriality is always counterbalanced or is always resisted by or in exchange with portraiture's focus on the individual or individuality.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me with regard to Holly's paper and my paper was that there was this problem of trying to represent a broad sovereign structure by representing individuals. And when Tresidder tries to do this, he does it quite well in some ways because everybody is so similar, because there's this flattening effect of photography, but that comes with its own problems. But the interesting thing about the Indian way of doing this from Holly's paper seems to be that they have this aesthetic mode which manages to actually retain a sense of the sitter's individuality. I think those portraits are all much more sort of demarcated from one another. And yet they give this sort of viable, unified system by tying it all together with the Oriental patterns. And that's something which the British, I think, when they simply lack that visuality, they lack the ability to retain individuality within the sovereign structure. And this is a problem that painters grappled with as well. And you mentioned the conference last year, and there I was talking about a vast group portrait by a painter called Val Prinsep, which was of numerous Indian Maharajas and prominent British officials. And he groups them all together. He does individual portrait studies. But when he places them all together in a group portrait, it's absolute chaos. It's a total mess. And so the sort of viability of the polity is undermined by the aesthetic discordance of the painting. And critics responded with total hostility. So I think the British were constantly struggling with those ideas of how to use portraiture with its emphasis on individuality to represent collective structures. But it seems that in India, at the same time, they had methods of doing this.
And I have to bring one anecdote up because it's so nice way to describe it. There are tensions or discomforts also from the Indian side in terms of portraiture in particular, especially the face forward. And if you'll notice or remember in the wall painting that I showed, Victoria's head has moved into a profile. And in the Mughal idiom and many other older methods of representation, the profile view is both a means of identification, but it is in some ways a turning away from direct visual contact. And to support this, I recently read a beautiful couplet by a poet named Bedil from the 18th century, translated by Prashant Keshavmurthy, which discusses the anxiety about British portraiture practices and Indian portraiture practices. And he tells his beloved in this couplet, don't turn to face me like a British portrait, because I will be burnt by that gaze. And I think that's important. It's a poem, but I think it's really important because it shows both it shows a recognition of those practices and also, again, discomforts in some areas.
Yeah. So I would only add two things to that comment. The first is that Val Prinsep was Julia Margaret Cameron's nephew.
Yes.
The second, that this is all interconnected, that for her practice, as recorded in the Public Record Office and her copyrighted images, and the evidence of others who witnessed her practice, she combined portraiture and these allegorical setup, arranged tableaus that have an allegorical element to them. And very often, in fact, it was very much her practice, to reserve titling them until she had them before her and she could see them in relationship to each other, and then would give them a title. And the title would often have an allegorical meaning. So in the Public Record Office, the photographs are almost described analytically, forensically, shown full face, shown half portrait, shown three-quarter view, holding various props that may or may not be labeled, but whose significance needs to be understood later, especially in relationship to a title that was appended later. So that gets to a kind of complexity, because we tend to now think of Cameron's portraits as being separate from her so-called fancy subjects. And in reality, they were all taken on the same time, very often with the same portrait session.
I think we need to break for lunch. Unfortunately, time is always too short, but please thank our three speakers.